Hello, this is Kyrasis, and in this Blood Death Knight analysis video, we're going to review how to Deathstrike optimally. This includes a quick look at Deathstrike mechanics, the importance of runic power, when we want to use Deathstrike, and the concept of bad Deathstrikes. The first mechanic we'll look at is Deathstrike healing. The base healing of our Deathstrike is determined by either a percentage of our maximum health or a percentage of the damage we have taken in the last 5 seconds. In general, Deathstrike healing is going to be based on damage taken if you've taken any meaningful amount of damage at all. However, friendly fire damage or damage dealt to you by the environment is not considered in this calculation, which includes damage from many Mythic Plus affixes such as Grievous and Storming. This base healing value is then multiplied by any healing done multipliers you have, such as increased healing done from versatility. And a percentage of that total healing also generates a physical damage absorb shield whose size is based on your mastery rating. This shield will always be generated based on the full healing value of your Deathstrike, even if it overheals you. If you talent Voracious, this will further multiply all Deathstrike healing, including the size of your blood shields. The talent Hemostasis also increases Deathstrike healing, but it will only increase the normal healing of Deathstrike and not the size of your blood shield. Almost all healing multipliers affect both the base healing of Deathstrike and the size of your blood shield, but this is one of the few exceptions to that rule. The only other healing multiplier I'm aware of right now that does not affect blood shield size is the healing reduction aura from Executioner Veruth in patch 9.1 Mythic Plus Dungeons. Second, we are going to review Deathstrike runic power cost mechanics. The base cost of Deathstrike is 45 runic power. If we are staying at 5 or more stacks of Bone Shield, Ossuary reduces this cost by 5 runic power. If used, the legendary effect Bryndaur's Might can refund 15% of the Deathstrike cost. And if you are using both Bryndaur's Might and Rune of Hysteria, the refund effect from Bryndaur's Might can be amplified by Rune of Hysteria's proc effect. This can reduce the average cost of Deathstrike from 45 runic power all the way down to approximately 33.5 runic power. But our Deathstrikes will usually cost 40 runic power, since Bryndaur's Might isn't generally used in patch 9.1. With Deathstrike mechanics explained, we'll now take a look at the role of runic power. The main function of runic power is that it can be converted into health with Deathstrike. As such, runic power is effectively a second health bar. The more healing our Deathstrikes provide, and the less runic power these Deathstrikes cost, the more potential health our runic power pool can provide us. And, at any given time, our total health is a combination of both our current health and our runic power, which is also why Blood Death Knights are one of the more complicated tanks for healers to heal, since our health bar alone does not show how much health we have available at any given time. This is further complicated by the fact that burst damage can potentially kill Blood Death Knights before they can convert their runic power into health if they aren't playing carefully. With runic power explained, we'll now talk about how we actually want to use Deathstrike. There are 3 situations where we usually want to use Deathstrike. 1. To help our immediate survivability. 2. To prevent capping runic power. And 3. To burn down our runic power at the end of an encounter. First, we'll talk about survival Deathstrikes. When using Deathstrike for survival, we have 2 goals. First, we want to maximize the healing and mitigation of each individual Deathstrike, so that we're minimizing the amount of healing we need from our healers. Second, we want to make sure that we are using Deathstrike in a way that we are not going to die to burst damage before we can use our runic power. And, when conditions are right for survival Deathstrikes, we are generally prioritizing them over all other abilities because we don't want to die in the meantime. Let's take a closer look at the first objective, which is maximizing healing and mitigation. The first 2 things to keep in mind with Deathstrike healing is that we'll heal more if we have taken more damage in the last 5 seconds, and that, with the exception of blood shield healing, we can only heal for as much health as we are missing, which encourages us to be at lower health when we death strike. While there are some tracking methods available for damage taken in the last 5 seconds and how much your death strike is going to heal, it's not usually recommended to use these for two reasons. One, if your health is too low, we will want a death strike regardless of how much our death strike will heal. And two, if your health is low in the first place, more often than not, your death strike is going to be healing for a significant amount already. In other words, damage taken information or death strike healing information is often insufficient on its own, or it's not providing any significant new information that your health bar alone isn't telling you. As such, it is recommended to only consider your health bar when estimating how effective your death strike is going to be. While death strikes will continue to be more and more efficient, on average, the lower we're willing to let our health dip before death striking, the increase in death strike efficiency starts to taper off at lower health levels as it becomes more and more likely that death strike is not overhealing at all. Now, we'll look at the second objective of short-term survival. Our main consideration with short-term survival is how many effective hit points we have at any given time, which is roughly tracked by our current health. So, the lower our health drops before we are willing to death strike, the more likely we are to die from burst damage before we can get a death strike off. While having more health will always reduce the risk of dying to burst damage, this benefit diminishes as we have more and more health. Taken together, both objectives are trying to reduce the chance of us dying from either a lack of healing or burst damage, but leaning too heavily into one objective will come at the cost of the other. If we hold our death strikes until we are at extremely low health to maximize our death strike healing, we'll very easily die to burst damage in the meantime. However, if we keep over-aggressively topping our health to defend against burst damage, we'll need an excessive amount of healing from our healer to stay alive, since our death strikes won't be healing for as much as they could be, and will chronically be low on RP. As such, we want to strike a balance between the two, so that we have desirable levels of both mitigation and effective hit points. The two standard solutions to this are as follows. One, we can attempt to use our experience along with trial and error to intuitively death strike when we feel it is valuable. Or we can use a system to determine when we should be using death strike for survival. An example of a system would be to death strike whenever you are below 60% health, which is a simple system that works well in all types of content. In general, the advantage of using systems are that they make you play more consistently and allow you to spend less effort when performing your rotation, even when you aren't familiar with incoming damage patterns. Though the disadvantage is that systems aren't nearly as flexible as doing things on your own. If you come across a situation where your system doesn't work well, you can either attempt to tweak your system to account for this situation, or you can intuitively death strike in situations where you think it is more appropriate. Now, we'll review overcap prevention death strikes. When using death strikes to prevent overcapping runic power, we have two objectives. First, we want to minimize wasted runic power generation because less wasted runic power means more death strikes. Second, we want to maximize the size of our runic power pool, which will allow us to use more of our death strikes in situations where they will heal for more. And having a larger runic power pool will increase the size of our total health pool. These death strikes have a relatively high priority when their conditions are met, since we want to use them before we generate more runic power. Let's take a closer look at the first objective. If we want to prevent wasting runic power, the likelihood of wasting runic power goes down if we prioritize using Death Strike when our runic power levels are low. As our runic power gets closer to capping, runic power losses sharply increase, but these losses are nearly non-existent when you aren't close to the cap. For the second objective, maximizing runic power pooling is done by waiting until higher runic power levels before using Death Strike. Once we start running into our runic power cap, pooling benefits start to taper off a bit. Similar to survival death strikes, overcap death strikes have their own trade-offs between more runic power generation and a combination of higher death strike efficiency and higher levels of total health on hand. If we don't use these death strikes at all, we may be well protected against dangerous situations with our large RP pool, but we'll lose a lot of free mitigation and damage in the meantime when incoming damage isn't as dangerous and we're wasting runic power. Alternatively, if we aren't pulling runic power at all, we may not waste any runic power. But our Death Strike healing will be lower since we aren't timing our Death Strikes for healing efficiency, and we will quickly die in dangerous situations without any backup health to fall back on. So, we'll want to try and strike a balance where our runic power losses are minimal while also maintaining a healthy runic power pool. The general solutions to this problem are going to be similar to the ones for survival death strikes. You can either attempt to manually identify when you need to death strike before overcapping on runic power, or you can use a system that manages this for you. Before we talk about some possible systems, let's first talk about some considerations that go into making runic power thresholds. First, our runic power cap is 125 runic power in normal situations, or 145 runic power if we are using Rune of Hysteria. Second, the highest amount of runic power we can generate in a single global cooldown is 30 runic power. This involves using Heartstrike, which generates 15 runic power baseline, with Heartbreaker, which generates an additional 2 runic power per target hit, while you are standing in Death and Decay, which allows you to hit 5 targets with your Heartstrike. And while Dancing Rune Weapon is active, which will cause your Heartstrike to generate an extra 5 runic power regardless of the number of targets you hit. On top of this, there are a few potential sources of runic power generation that can either occur without warning or outside of your global cooldown, which can make this 30 runic power value even higher. If Swarming Mists is active, it could potentially tick twice during a global cooldown and generate 30 runic power on 5 targets. If you are interrupting an enemy with the Spirit Drain Conduit equipped, you'll instantly generate additional runic power depending on your conduit rank. If you are using the legendary effect Super Strain, your Frost Fever sporadically generates 5 runic power on 1 or more targets. And if you are using Rune of Hysteria, your runic power generation from all sources could sporadically increase by 20%. For now, we're going to ignore these additional sources of runic power generation, so we'll just assume that 30 runic power generation in a global cooldown is the most we will be able to generate, and that our maximum RP cap is 125. With these assumptions, using Death Strike when we are above 95 runic power should allow us to maximize our runic power pool without losing a single point of runic power. However, it's important to note that Dancing Rune Weapon and Death and Decay won't always be active, and there might not always be 5 targets on hand to cleave with Heartbreaker and Death and Decay. So, our Heartstrike won't always be able to generate 30 runic power. Because of this, anytime we can track and account for these conditions, like Dancing Rune Weapon and Death and Decay, it can allow us to maintain a higher runic power pool with no additional waste, whether we are keeping track of this manually or by using a weak aura. If we were just tracking when Dancing Rune Weapon wasn't active, we could safely increase our runic power threshold to 100 during these times. Similarly, when Swarming Mist is active, we could temporarily lower our runic power threshold to 65, so the runic power generated by Swarming Mist on 5 targets won't cause us to overcap runic power if we're heart striking at the same time. Now, let's assume we aren't actively tracking any buff effects and we want to use a fixed runic power threshold for our system to keep things simple. When using a fixed runic power threshold and no tracking, we're now back to the trade-off between sharply increasing runic power losses with higher runic power thresholds and runic power pooling benefits that start to taper off as our threshold gets closer to runic power cap. If you are moving a runic power threshold from 95 to 96 runic power, it may not be a big deal, since you are only potentially losing 1 runic power on heart strikes that are generating a full 30 runic power with all buffs active. But if you keep bumping that runic power threshold up, heart strikes that generate less than 30 runic power will start seeing losses, along with other sources of runic power generation. So, while some runic power losses may be worth the pooling benefits, there's going to be a breakpoint where this stops being true. However, it's hard to say where that breakpoint actually is, and it's probably different depending on what type of content you're trying to do and what your gear level is. If you're using a system, you will want to use whatever threshold works well for you, and you will want to use any tracking and adjustments as much as you can to account for mechanics that influence runic power generation, since any tracking you can do will allow you to have a higher runic power pool at no additional cost. A simple system for this is to death strike whenever you are above 105 runic power, which will result in a high runic power pool and only minor runic power losses. The equivalent value for this when using Rune of Hysteria would be 121 runic power, but feel free to use whatever works well for you. The third type of death strikes are burn down death strikes, and while they are not as important as the other two, they are a justifiable use of death strike. The goal with these death strikes is to end a raid encounter or dungeon with as close to 0 runic power as possible, since all runic power you have at the end of a raid encounter or a dungeon is technically wasted. As long as you aren't being too trigger happy with the death strikes and burning down all of your runic power when you still might need it for survivability, this type of death strike is a net gain at no cost. With the main uses of death strike explained, we'll quickly touch on the concept of bad death strikes. There's a fourth type of death strike that I previously didn't talk about, and these are bad death strikes. In short, bad death strikes are ones that aren't used for any of the previous goals. They are not efficient for healing or mitigation. They are not helping us survive burst damage. They are not helping with runic power management, and they are not justified by using them at the end of an encounter. Instead, they are indirectly killing you by needlessly reducing the size of your runic power pool with little to no benefit. Other than efficiently using survival death strikes, reducing the number of bad death strikes should be your top priority when you are trying to improve your death strike play. If you were to make a graph of the health and runic power levels you had before using death strike, then bad death strikes are the ones you are using when your health is high and your runic power is low. This video reviewed some of the healing and runic power mechanics associated with Deathstrike. It explored the concept of runic power as a second health bar. It explained the three primary uses of Deathstrike, and it explored the concept of bad death strikes. If this content was helpful to you, or if there are any additional topics you would like to see, leave a comment below or contact me through Discord. My information can be found in the video description below. In the meantime, good luck with your tanking and have fun.